up or anything. But for those of you that don't know me, my name is Leah Berger. I am a member of North Dakotans Against Common Core, as well as another organization, the Alliance for Local Control of Education. And we are so proud to have Jane Robbins here. She is from the American Principles Project. She has been published numerous times, print, media, and she's also co-authored a report with the Pioneer Institute outlining the dangers of Common Core. So I think she has a lot to say and a lot that you'll find very interesting. So without further ado, here is Jane Robbins.
Okay, thank you very much. It is a delight to be here. I have never been to North Dakota, so this is exciting. It's a great state with great people, and so I'm real pleased for the opportunity. And a great turnout. This is wonderful. I didn't know how, because sometimes I told them that I have spoken to 750 people and I've spoken to 5. So this is a very nice in-between, so good. I'm going to try to not tell you everything in the world about Common Core because I don't know everything in the world about it. Every week something new comes up and I think, I wonder about that. And I need to investigate that because this is a many layered thing. And there are all kinds of layers, all kinds of arms and legs on this thing. What I'm going to try to do is give you an overview of what it is, how it got here, what the problems are, and then at the end sort of give you the bigger picture. And we will have questions, so if you've got questions to ask, because I might not cover something that's important, because I couldn't put everything in, but please do ask me. So, this is, what is Common Core? Common Core is a set of standards, K-12, English, language arts, and math standards that were created, designed to centralize education in those topic areas and ultimately in other areas as well. Once you get the structure built, then you can bring in the other topics. They want it to be a one-size-fits-all. North Dakota does have Common Core standards. They call them the North Dakota standards. Like in Florida, they call them the Sunshine Standards. And if you look at Florida and line them up next to North Dakota, you'd be surprised to know that y'all have the Sunshine State Standards. So Common Core is an attempt to, by the federal government and special interest groups, primarily special interest groups in Washington, to standardize education. It's in English language arts and math right now, although English language arts also includes what they call literacy in other subjects, such as history, social studies, science, and technical subjects. So the way they're getting the content from those other areas into Common Core is to bring it in through the English curriculum. So we're going to have English teachers teaching documents, teaching technical documents. Does anybody see any potential problems with that? My mother was an English teacher for 30 years, and she would have quit early on if she had had to teach this. All right. Where did the standards come from? They did not come from the federal government. We have never claimed that they came from the federal government. They came from a group of private organizations in Washington, D.C., the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. Now, if you look at National Governors Association, you think, well, this sounds like it's all the governors, right? And they get together and decide they're going to do this. That's not what the NGA is. It's a private trade association, as is the Council of Chief State School Officers. Some governors are members, some aren't. We don't know who are members because they won't tell us. We know some people that aren't. Rick Perry is not. Nikki Haley in South Carolina is not. But the NGA has a little group that decided that they would write national standards. They decided that because they got some funding to do that, and they worked through Achieve, which is a nonprofit group connected with the NGA. All of these groups are inside the Beltway, Washington, D.C. groups. They did not have a grant of legislative authority from anybody, from any state, to do anything. Where'd the money come from? Well, other than the fact that NGA and CCSSO are both funded by the federal government, which they don't highlight, the money came primarily from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They have spent, I can't give you the final number because I haven't looked in quite some time, but they have spent well over $200 million on Common Core. And that wasn't on developing the standards. It was mainly on, I mean, some of it was for developing the standards, but it was mainly on marketing the standards. And you do that by buying off groups to get them to support it. And some of the groups, okay, at the time we did this PowerPoint, which was several months ago, it was $170 million. And they have pledged, Bill has pledged $350 million more because that's the change under his seat cushions, and so he can do that. Since 1999, NGA and CCSSO have received over $100 million to do this. Mike Petrilli is with the Thomas Fordham Institute. You always hear this discussed, as we did in the debate this afternoon at the Chamber of Commerce, as a conservative education reform. They are not conservative. Believe me, they are not. And they are on the Common Core bandwagon. Why are they on the Common Core bandwagon? Because the Gates Foundation has paid them over $7 million to be on the Common Core bandwagon. Mike Petrilli is the president of Fordham, and he said in an article in the New York Times, it is not unfair to say that the Gates Foundation's agenda has become the country's agenda in education. Now, everybody in here who has ever voted for Bill Gates, please raise your hand. Why should he be telling us what should be done in our schools? But I was talking last night with one of the representatives, and someone had pointed out to me what he thought, and someone who knows Bill Gates, what he thought was the real motive. I mean, there's a lot of money involved here, but look at the way Bill Gates made his money. He made his money with an operating system that is used by everybody on the planet, and it's very efficient. Why can't we do that with education? Why can't we have a Common Core operating system, and we'll impose it on every school, and we will train, not educate, but train every student under Common Core, and it will be very efficient. Why do we have these 50 states anyway? And why is North Dakota doing something different from Iowa? I mean, how silly is that? Who set this up anyway? It wasn't computer geeks who set it up, but they're the ones who are now running our education. These are some of the organizations that the Gates money has gone to get them to support Common Core. Pearson Foundation. Pearson is the multi-global, universal textbook publisher, and they're into all the digital learning and all that kind of stuff. It's a British company run by socialist Sir Michael Barber. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation has received a lot of money. The Chamber affiliate, the Institute for Competitive Workforce, has received many millions from Gates to support Common Core. The Fordham Institute, the National PTA, the NEA, the AFT, although the teachers' unions are actually fighting back some. They're slipping through the traces here because in some states, such as New York, the teachers are in open revolt over this. And so the national union people have had to say, wait, we're not sure this is a good idea. The Foundation for Excellence in Education, you know who runs that? That's Jeb Bush. That's his foundation in Florida, and he is Mr. Common Core. So these are just some of the groups. It is very unusual to find a group that will come and speak in favor of Common Core that has not received Gates money. It happens occasionally, but not often. Okay, how was the federal government involved? The federal government responded to a request from the NGA and CCSSO right in the interim between the 2008 election and the inauguration of Barack Obama. They put out a report called Benchmarking for Success, and they said, we've got to have these national standards because everybody knows that something that's done centralized and national is better than something that's done locally, right? So they said, we've got to have national standards, and we need the federal government to be involved, and we need the government to tie federal money to it to get the states to go with it. So the federal government responded with the stimulus bill. Y'all remember that? Stimulus bill in 2009, where we spent almost $1 trillion for no apparent reason. Well, one thing that was in the stimulus bill was a $4.35 billion earmark to the U.S. Department of Education, which it then used to fund something called the Race to the Top competition. That's where states were pitted against each other to compete for money that was theirs to start with. Was the legislature involved in this? No. Nowhere was the legislature involved. This was all done on an executive level. The governor and the chief and the state school superintendent had to sign off on it. And the legislature was not involved at all. And probably 2 years ago, if you had asked your legislators, so what do you think of Common Core? They would have looked at you like, what? And it's not that they're not paying attention, it's that they were deliberately kept out of the loop. And look, I know that North Dakota did not get Race to the Top money, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the other, to get Race to the Top money, you had to adopt Common Core. And the proponents will say, oh, no, you didn't. It doesn't say anywhere in the application that you had to adopt Common Core. Yes, it does, but it doesn't use those words. It says you shall adopt these college and career-ready standards that are put out by a consortium of states and blah, 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 blah. The only thing that fit that was Common Core. So if somebody tells you you did not have to adopt Common Core to get Gates money, to get, well, federal money, they're lying. Okay, you also had to do two other things. You had to agree to adopt the National Common Core test, Common Core Aligned test, and to build out your huge student databases, because this is all about data, guys. You've got to have the data. And so there were two assessment consortia. The states went into one of two assessment consortia that were going to develop these tests. One is called Smarter Balance, one is called PARC, Partnership for Assessment of Readiness, et cetera, et cetera. Both of these are funded by $360 million in federal tax money. That is illegal. There is a statute that prohibits the federal government from creating tests, so it pays other people to do it. And this is the brave new world of student testing. It's supposed to be, you can't just have tests that just test to see if a kid knows something. That's so 20th century. We're in the 21st century now. Now we have to have students doing performance events and projects and all this kind of stuff, which sounds just as good as gold until you realize that this has been tried before in testing. It's been tried specifically, I know about, in Kentucky from 20 years ago. And they spent millions of dollars on this kind of cutting-edge testing in Kentucky. And after about 3 years, it crashed and burned in 1996. So if you're interested in looking at some of that, there's a man at the Bluegrass Institute in Kentucky. His name is Richard Innes, I-N-N-E-S. You can Google some of the things that he's written about this. But the testing is exactly what they have been trying to do in other areas, and it's never worked. North Dakota is in the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, which I have to tell you, I'm sorry to do this, but is of the two, it is the weird, wacko, leftist one. One of the educrats at the Georgia Department of Education, when I asked her why Georgia was going into PARC rather than into Smarter Balance, she sort of laughed and she said, well, we're just not quite that liberal. Smarter Balance is run essentially by a woman named Linda Darling Hammond. I also suggest that you read some of the things that she has written, because it's not reminiscent of what I would consider the values of the heartland. Okay, all right. North Dakota did not apply for Race to the Top money, and we heard that this afternoon in the chamber. Oh no, we didn't even apply for this money, so we were not being forced by the federal government to do this. But this was the big education reform. This was sweeping the nation. Nobody wanted to be left behind on this. And so North Dakota joined the Common Core by committing to the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, because when you signed your Memorandum of Understanding, you agreed to adopt Common Core. And this is what the Memorandum of Understanding says. Each state agrees to the following element: adopt the Common Core standards, and to which the consortium's assessment system will be aligned by December 31st, 2011. So by signing that MOU, which was done by your governor, Governor Hoeven, and State School Superintendent Wayne Sandstead in 2010, you agreed to adopt the Common Core standards, and in fact, they were adopted. So whether you did this for the Race to the Top money or you did it otherwise, it really doesn't matter. But this is the way all of the other states got on board. Because they were trying to get this Race to the Top money. I think 47 states applied for Race to the Top money. And you'll notice the date on this. The governor's signature was June 4th. The other one was June 2nd. You know when the Common Core standards were released? June 2nd of 2010. So the same day they were released, Mr. Sandstead said North Dakota will hop on board. All right. Okie doke. All right, and so then they said, okay, well, we're going to have people look at these standards. Since we haven't really officially adopted them, we just signed this MOU. So we'll have somebody look at them and tell us whether they are better than North Dakota standards. So they hired McCrell, Mid-Continent Research for Education and Learning, this is a consulting group, to analyze the Common Core standards. And McCrell, which is very tied financially to the U.S. Department of Education, surprisingly came up with a conclusion that Common Core is better than the North Dakota standards. Who would have seen that coming? So then they say, well, look, McCrell says we need to do this, so they did it. All right, is this legal? No, it is not. The U.S. Constitution, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, does not give the federal government any power or authority over education. That is reserved to the states. And by pushing these standards and pushing the assessments, which are also, by the way, Smarter Balance is creating curriculum modules. And this is important to know because there are 3 federal statutes that prohibit the federal government from supervising, directing, or controlling curriculum. And that's what they're doing by funding Smarter Balance. They're violating 3 federal statutes. They're also violating another statute that says that the federal government cannot create tests. So they pay somebody else to create the test. See how this works? The central thing you need to know about these standards, other than the fact that they're copyrighted and belong to the NGA and the CCSSO, and you can't change anything that you don't like about them, is that they are nothing new. They are recycled failure. They focus on not academic knowledge, but on what they call 21st century skills. Anytime anybody tells you that we've got to focus on the 21st century, well, okay, but why is math different in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century? And well, you're saying it's not. Well, clearly you're a 20th century kind of guy, you know. But they're not interested in academic knowledge. And if anybody, I mean, a lot of you here are too young to remember outcome-based education, but some aren't. Some may remember this. Outcome-based education was the great education fad sweeping the nation back in the 90s. And it was exactly what it was. It focused on skills, it focused on attitudes, it focused on getting kids to behave the way you wanted them to behave. And you do things over and over and over again until the kids finally come around and they do what you want them to do. It's not about academic knowledge. It's not about actually learning anything. That's what outcome-based education was. And it died, we thought, but like in a horror movie, you know, the monster is never really dead, he comes back. And he's back under Common Core. The goal of Common Core, you have to remember this is not, well, there are a lot of other goals, and I'll tell you about them a little bit later. The central goal is workforce development. This is not an education model, it is a workforce development model. They are training kids for entry-level jobs. That's what they are doing. Whether they admit it or not, that's exactly what they're doing, and you'll see as we go along some of that. All right, now I had a woman who testified against us in a hearing in South Carolina a couple years ago. She was one of the assistant superintendents of, you know, curriculum for 4th grade kids whose name starts with D or something. You know, I've never seen as many administrators in my life. But they had all these administrators come up and testify against our bill, our Common Core withdrawal bill. And she said, well, that she had heard a lot today from all of our witnesses about how this was unconstitutional, it's illegal, and she said, I don't know anything about that, and I don't care about that. I just think the standards are good. And I thought, well, there in a nutshell is what's wrong with our country. We don't care if it's legal, we don't care if it's constitutional. If it's achieving what we want to achieve, then we'll do it. Does that seem familiar to anybody with anything else going on in the world? But given the fact that they say that, you know, these standards are so great, let's look at them. This is a picture of Dr. James Milgram. He is a professor emeritus at Stanford University. He was the only mathematician on the Common Core Validation Committee. He refused to sign off on the standards because he was appalled at what they were. And he concluded the Common Core standards will put our students about 2 years, at least 2 years behind the students of high-achieving countries, and places like Singapore, Japan, Finland, because they are so different from the math standards of those countries, and they're teaching our children to do things that are different and that do not actually teach them math. For one thing, the key here is the standard algorithm. When do you learn the standard algorithm? Which, if you're not into math lingo, which I certainly wasn't until I started doing this, the standard algorithm is the way everybody since, you know, Adam and Eve have done math. You put numbers over each other and you add and you carry, you know, and all that. Common Core eventually teaches that, but in the early grades, they don't teach it. They want children to get deeper conceptual understanding. That's a buzzword. This all is no buzzword left behind. And you don't get deeper conceptual understanding by just doing it the way everybody's always done it. That doesn't teach you anything other than rote memorization, which is so 20th century. You can't have rote memorization. So even though our major competitors teach it in 1st grade, we don't. Now we're going to teach some of it in 4th grade. Some of it will be moved, like for multiplication and division, will be moved to 5th grade or 6th grade. This is way behind the high-achieving countries, way behind. Algebra 1 is being pushed back to 9th grade instead of 8th grade. I don't know if you were teaching in 8th grade or 9th grade, but the problem, about half the country was teaching Algebra 1 in 8th grade, and the reason was that then students can get to calculus by senior year. And you have to do that if you're going to go to a selective university, or certainly if you're going to study a STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and math. You've got to have calculus. At Stanford, where Dr. Milgram taught, calculus is considered remedial. And I went to a very painful education, sort of progressive ed conference in Atlanta about a year ago. And one of the speakers there, who wasn't talking about Common Core, was the president of Georgia Tech, Dr. Bud Peterson. And he mentioned in his talk, not talking about Common Core, that we've got to teach kids Algebra 1 in 8th grade so that they can get to calculus by senior year, because if you don't do that, you can't go to Georgia Tech. And so I perked up. I was almost asleep at that point, but I wrote that down because the president of Georgia Tech had just said Common Core is not going to prepare kids for this. Now, what your DPI will tell you, I am sure, is that, oh no, you can still get to this. You know, we'll have an accelerated track, so kids can still do it. Well, yeah, theoretically, kids could still do it if they get some outside tutoring, if their parents are college graduates and know to get them on that accelerated track. But for the masses of kids, the ones who maybe live in a trailer with their mother who, you know, is working 2 jobs and she doesn't know that she needs to be thinking, you know, in 6th grade about what they're going to be taking in 12th grade. I mean, how many of us thought about that? Those kids are going to get Algebra 1 in 9th grade and will not get to calculus. But under the Common Core theory, that's okay. It's workforce development. They'll get a job somewhere. Geometry. This is the one that the point I made in the debate this afternoon, and Ms. Baszler said, they asked her if that was true, and she said no, and then she went on and talked about something else. So I didn't find that a particularly persuasive response, but the way Common Core dictates that geometry will be taught is by an experimental method never used successfully anywhere in the world in K-12. It was developed by a Soviet mathematician in the 1960s. He developed it and tried it on Soviet math prodigies, and they didn't get it. So he put it away. Well, Common Core takes it back, and that's the way they're teaching geometry. And you know, sometimes I think that the Kumon math tutors are the ones behind this whole thing, because everybody is sending their kids to Kumon or to some math tutoring because they're not getting it in school. They don't learn the standard algorithms, and the geometry is just a mess. And no teachers have been trained to teach geometry this way, but that's what they're doing. Common Core stops in math. It stops with Algebra 2, and it's not even a complete Algebra 2 course. It's part of an Algebra 2 course. There is very little trigonometry. There's no pre-calculus and no calculus. One of the 3 men who wrote the math standards, there were 3 men who wrote the math standards, 2 who wrote the English standards, so much for this state-led governors all together kind of thing. One of these men said, he admitted in a meeting in Massachusetts in 2010 that Common Core math was not designed for selective universities. It was designed to get kids into non-selective community colleges because that, of course, is the workforce development model. The College Board Vice President Trevor Packer, who is in charge of AP Calculus, AP courses, and is also in hot water over AP US History, which I'll get to in a minute, he said last summer, AP Calculus is in conflict with the Common Core and will probably go away. What he was saying was they're probably going to get rid of AP Calculus because Common Core won't get enough students ready for AP Calculus. He said, we'll maybe have some sort of AP Algebra or AP, or in the meantime you could take AP Computer Science or AP, but it's not going to be AP Calculus. Standards author Jason Zimba, the one who said this is for a non-selective community college, admitted, if you want to take calculus your freshman year in college, you will need to take more mathematics than is in the Common Core. These are the people who wrote it, and they accuse us of making stuff up. This is Dr. Sandra Stotsky, who will be in North Dakota next month sometime. Please shake her hand when she comes, because she is a heroine in this fight. She is the nation's leading expert on English standards. She essentially wrote the Massachusetts English standards, which were the best in the nation before they gave them up for Common Core and $250 million federal dollars. She was on the Common Core Validation Committee and is appalled by what came out of the two people who wrote the standards, neither of whom had ever taught English, and one of whom had never written standards. She refused to sign off on it on the validation committee, and now she goes around the country telling people they need to get out of this. And so they are ruining the day that they put Sandy Stotsky on the validation committee, because now she won't shut up, and she knows how all of this happened. And I encourage you to go to her event when she comes to North Dakota. The main difference between Common Core English and normal English is that it diminishes the study of fiction, of great literature. And this is a problem that has been going on in education for some time. The schools have been downplaying great literature because it's not relevant. You know, let's have baloney pop literature and let's have them read The Hunger Games rather than read, you know, David Copperfield. And so that's been a problem, and Common Core takes that problem and makes it worse. It just says, oh heck, they don't need to read any literature at all. Or they'll read some literature, but the English teachers, the English standards dictate that the English teachers spend less than half their time on literary fiction. And they're supposed to spend the other part of their time on nonfiction, what they call informational text. So over half the time will be that. And they have recommendations for that kind of thing. It could be something good. It could be the Gettysburg Address. On the other hand, it could be EPA regulations for asbestos removal. And you think I'm making this up. They talk about court cases, that you could study court cases. In an English class, I've been reading court cases for 30 years, and frequently I don't understand them. And you expect a high school English teacher to teach a court case? I mean, who comes up with this? This is completely experimental, but remember, this is a workforce development model. What they're trying to do, their vision is that, well, we'll teach kids to read the kinds of documents they will read on their jobs. And you don't read Paradise Lost on your job, so why bother with Paradise Lost? Well, what do you get from Paradise Lost? You get an understanding of the human condition, don't you? You get our culture. Our culture is transmitted through literature. That's always the way it's been. It's always the way it will be. And when you diminish that, you are separating, you are distancing children from their culture. And I don't think this is an unintended consequence. The idea is to dumb it down. If it's good enough for a job in the economic machine, it is good enough. As bad as the high school standards are, the early childhood standards, K through 3, K through 2, are really awful, because the people who wrote them had no idea what they were doing. There were no K through 3 teachers on the writing committee, and there were no experts in child development. So they came up with these standards that literally expect 5-year-olds to do things that their brains are not developed to do. And they brag on that. They say, well, that means they're rigorous. That means they're hard. You don't want to give a 5-year-old something that he physically can't do, mentally can't do. I mean, what are you doing for his future education? Is he going to love school? When children are coming home from kindergarten crying, I mean, I asked you, did y'all go to kindergarten? I did. We slid down the sliding board. We had story time. We colored. And it was fun. And that's what kindergarten is supposed to be. Now it's rigorous. We're preparing them for their future jobs. So there was a group of 500 early childhood development experts who put out a statement. This was reported in the Washington Post, expressing, as they say, grave concerns about the Common Core standards, because they go against everything we know about neuroscience and about cognitive development. And so they're only going to be potentially devastating to young children.